Hello everybody, Monique here. Today I'm going to walk you through how I created this piece, a 10th anniversary gift commission for somebody I used to work with. This piece was really cool, by far the most complicated piece that I've ever taken on before. I've been freelancing with illustration for about a month now, so I finally have the time to devote to more complicated pieces like this, and it was really exciting for me to be able to get to do this. So what you're seeing here is the design phase at the very beginning of the project. This is just tiny little thumbnails where I'm going through and trying to figure out what the general layout of the piece was going to be. I had a lot of creative freedom with this, which is awesome. The client was great. So I was just kind of trying to play around with different orientations. He gave me some indication of what he wanted to have in there. We definitely wanted to have representation of all of their homes, representation of the fact that he was from the UK and she's from New York, and then just a ton of details about their lives over the last 10 years. This was a 10th wedding anniversary. So I'm just going through trying to come up with as many different configurations as possible. Once upon a time, I heard from a really good illustration teacher that I follow that you should create 50 thumbnails before you pick one. But given the time pressure of the fact that this needed to be done by the end of the month and I was out of town for a little while, I only did 24, so don't tell anyone. So here we are. Basically what I was doing is I picked my favorite 3 of the thumbnails that I had been creating on the previous screen that you saw there with all the boxes. I picked my favorite 3, blew them up slightly larger, and I'm now going through and creating a little bit more detail for each one. At the end of this phase was when I showed the client for the first time, so I wanted to make sure I put a lot of annotations on there so that he kind of understood what I was thinking. Some folks are able to see rough sketches and kind of understand what the final is going to look like. Other folks need a little bit more detail in order to be able to understand, so I just try to err on the side of more detail, so that people have as much of a preview as possible of what's about to come. What you're seeing here is the value stage, just a little bit of an indication of where the dark pieces are going to be and where the light pieces are going to be. The screen is moving fast. So after I showed him the rough sketches, I've moved on to the color studies. And what we did at the rough sketch phase was we picked one of the layouts just as sort of like direction moving forward. I made a couple of edits to that. And now I took that and duplicated it 2 additional times, and I'm coming up with different color studies here. So we have different, indications of what the color might be moving ahead in the future. I was given permission to kind of choose whatever color I wanted moving forward. So I had that in the back of my mind, and now we're starting to work on the final art. So I took that tiny rough sketch, blew it up full size, and now I'm starting to go in and add a lot more detail. What you see here is actually even a little bit more detail than I would do normally. Sometimes I go in and create 2 or 3 additional rough sketches right on top of that. The nice part about doing it digitally is that you could just keep putting layers and layers and layers on top of things and adding more and more and more detail. You'll see with this piece that I start to deviate quite a bit from what you would consider the normal quote-unquote correct way of creating a piece, which is kind of an assembly line where you do everything across the whole piece in one layer of detail, and then more, and then more, and then more, but you're doing it to the entire piece moving forward. With this one, I kind of took a haphazard approach where I latched on to something that I was feeling good about and took that to a little bit more of a state of completion before I started working on some other aspects. So you see here that I have a lot of detail going on in the frame itself, but we don't see much else happening in the rest of the piece yet. I can't really tell you why. I was probably just avoiding the more difficult pieces, and I wanted to get this frame in there first. It was feeling good, so that's what I ran with. This changes all the time. I mean, there is a quote-unquote right way of doing illustrations, but the number of artists that do it the quote-unquote right way is probably pretty small. Plus, hey, it's art. So what I'm doing now is actually even more detail. I'm going through and adding the cross-hatching, which you may or may not be able to see depending on the size of your screen. I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the frame itself to give it a little bit of dimension. Again, this is usually a stage that happens a little later on in the process, but I'm doing it now, baby. all of those leaves were a little bit of a pain in the butt to draw. I don't usually draw a lot of plant life. I stick to characters and faces mostly because I like it, because it's easy for me, and it's what I enjoy drawing the most. Plant life is intimidating to me because of how complex and how chaotic it is. If you can't tell by my anal retentive cross-hatching that's going on here, I'm a very particular, very perfectionisty kind of person, and trying to draw plant life stresses out that part of my brain. So now I'm actually going in and adding shading to all those little tiny leaves in there. So we're doing the shading on the left-hand side. The nice part, again, about working digitally is that I was able to do that left side of the raspberry bush. And then I could basically just copy and paste what I did on the left side and put it over onto the right side. What that did was it allowed me to, number one, only do half of it. But number two, when I copied and pasted it and transferred it over and flipped it to the other side, I was able to make like a couple of strategic little differences between the left and the right to kind of breathe a little bit of organicness into it. So it was not identical, but, you know, a whole lot easier than if I had to draw all of those things individually. So now I'm actually even dipping into a little bit of color. Again, I probably wouldn't have done this if I was following something that I would consider, quote unquote, the right way of doing it, but I wanted to start to get the color story in there. This poster that you keep seeing popping up on the screen is an inspiration that I had found on the internet, on Pinterest of all things. I was going to enter a book cover contest last month, but I was still working full time and I didn't have enough time, so I didn't do it. But when I was researching what I might do for that book cover contest, I came across that poster of Pan's Labyrinth, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous poster. Maybe I'll put a link to it in the details of this video. Super detailed, really interesting, and I wanted to give that a shot. I hadn't really done anything that detailed before, but I thought that I probably could, and it was interesting to me to do something of that level of detail. So actually this project was a great way for me to kind of pull in that idea and play around with that layout style a little bit. Obviously what you see right now is me playing around with the figures for the first time. Likeness is always weird. I have done and can do photorealistic portraits, either in pencil, colored pencil, pastel. I've done it in the past. I used to do it a lot more than I have recently, but I didn't necessarily want to do that here. Moving forward, I'm definitely more interested in what I would consider illustration rather than fine art or photorealistic portraiture. So I didn't want to get bogged down in photorealism here. I wanted to maintain some sense of, you know, what my illustration style has been evolving into lately. So there was this interesting period of back and forth where I was trying to get the likeness of the figures, so it is at least evocative of what these folks actually look like, but without, you know, going crazy with the details. I'm trying to make it look like a portrait. That was hard. I will admit that was really hard. I don't even know that I'm totally happy with the way that part turned out, but yeah, it's a work in progress. Trying to create almost like a caricature of folks is sometimes even more challenging than just doing a photorealistic portrait of them, if I'm perfectly honest. What you see me doing here is actually laying down a lot of big flat color on top of those leaves so that I can get a really nice blend and a really nice gradient, and then I'm erasing away all of the bits that fall in between each leaf. That allows me to get a much smoother gradient without having to kind of like get all up in between all those little leaves. It's easier for me to erase away that negative space than it is for me to add a nice smooth gradient into the positive space. So that's that. Playing around with a little bit of color in the portraiture right now. You'll notice that these figures change a lot over the next, you know, what is several hours in real time, but what will be several minutes for you guys. Again, here I'm playing with the faces a little bit more. This is something that, had I had infinity time to create this project, I probably could have played around with for a long, long time. I was actually taking a look at some Disney animation videos a couple weekends ago when I was in the middle of this project. watching Disney animators and how they stylize faces. And there was one guy that was actually doing a caricature of Walt Disney, which I found really interesting. And then I follow a couple of other animators for places that are not Disney, like Sony Pictures, I think they work. And they were having some caricature contests with some of their colleagues. You know, caricature work is difficult, but it's a lot of fun. So, you know, I could have played with that for the rest of my life, but eventually I was like, you know what, let's move on. So now I'm starting to get into some of the more detail-y work that starts to happen around these frames. You see me kind of tackling pieces of this project in order of what intimidates me most, or rather in order of what intimidates me least to what intimidates me most. So we start with, you know, the straight lines, perfect circles of the frame, move on to the raspberry bush, move on to the figures, which is kind of a tried and true love drawing people and faces, and now I'm starting to deal with some of this more complicated stuff that happens on the outsides of these frames. On this internal frame, we wanted to play around with the different homes that these folks lived in over the course of their relationship. On the top, we have the current home that they live in. On the bottom is the first home that they moved into when they moved to the DC area. On the left-hand side is the representation of New York. They had a couple of homes there. And then on the right-hand side is the representation of London, which is where, you know, the husband is from. I wanted to play around with showing some little semblance of a skyline behind each one, just to give a little bit of an indication of where their lives took place from a city standpoint. But I also wanted that to fall into the background a little bit more, and I wanted to highlight these homes that they lived in, or in the case of London, some landmarks that were important to sort of where they met and the early portions of their relationship. This is just a lot of detail work. The nice part about stylizing buildings and homes and skylines and that kind of stuff is that you don't have to worry about a likeness. So you can make it a little funkier and a little cooler, and you don't necessarily have to worry about, you know, does that look exactly right? Which is kind of cool. I did use the equivalent of a straight edge for the outside of the frame, both frames really, and the circles in the corner. I did use a perfect circle. Basically, you could trace a perfect circle in the Procreate app, which is what I use on the iPad here. I did that for the sun and the moon as well. And then you'll see for the engagement and the wedding ring later on. But for the most part, when it got to this detail-y stuff around the outside here, I wanted to try to stay away from using a straight edge or using a perfect circle, because I didn't want this to be, I didn't want it to start to feel too refined or too, I don't know, computational. I wanted it to definitely feel like it was hand-drawn. And I wanted it to be illustrative. You have to be careful with using too many straight edges and circles and stuff when you're trying to go for an illustrative style, because it just kind of like, I don't know, it pulls all the life out of it, which is definitely something that I struggle with. You have illustrators that err on the side of too little detail and too much feeling, and illustrators that err on the side of too much detail, too much refinement to the point where it just kills the energy of the piece. I definitely fall into the latter half of illustrators that I just mentioned. I kill things with fire sometimes when it comes to detail. So I wanted to make sure that I left some energy in the piece, and I left a handmade feel to the piece. So I toyed with the idea of changing that text down there, the first 10 years, to be typographical, kind of trace over the type, and make a couple of edits there. But I decided at the end of the day that I would leave it in the cursive. I went to Catholic school for 9 years, so my cursive is nice. And it gives you that handmade feel, which I really like. So now you can see that I've finally gotten to the point where I'm starting to tackle all of those objects on the outer frame. Working on the Ford Mustang right now, That was a lot. I went through, I had a lot of back and forth with the husband where we were going through and looking at different ideas, and he was sending me a bunch of pictures, and he was awesome, super responsive the entire time, and willing to kind of just let me do my own thing and figure it out. But also gave me a lot of really, really good detail, which was really helpful in having enough detail to come in and add all of these things to the outside. So the first thing I did was I created a list on just a piece of paper of different objects that I could use. And then I took that list and did exactly what you're seeing right now. I sketched them all in really, really rough. And I tried to do it in a way where they were spread out, and I would just fill in kind of a systemic way so that nothing was squashed at the end or nothing were big gaping holes at the end. And it was, a slower process because I had to put all those things in there, but it was actually a lot easier to fill all that stuff in than I was expecting it to be, quite honestly. He gave me a ton of really good information and a lot of details that I could use, and it was just a matter of drawing all of them, so that was really cool. Now you can see I'm going over, I took that rough sketch layer and I pulled the opacity all the way down, and now I'm going over and doing the final, what you would call, quote unquote, the final inking, but I'm actually still using a pencil tool because I liked the texture of it. And I'm just going through and I'm making it a cleaner pass over top, getting rid of all the sketchiness, adding all of the text in, again, handwritten, also adding a bunch of cross-hatching in. The way that I've been illustrating lately, I start black and white, with the exception of this time where I started adding a little bit of color a little bit earlier on. But I usually start with black and white, and I take it as far as possible with just black and white, just cross-hatching to add all of the shadow. And then I'll start to add a little bit of color behind it, just to give it a little bit of tone, but not relying too much on the painting of the color, more so relying on the cross-hatching to add that tone and to add the value. I keep turning these color layers on and off kind of on a whim. There's no rhyme or reason for cross-hatching with the color on or with the color off. I just happen to have it turned on at this point. A note on the color of that internal frame detail. You'll notice that I have a couple of different color styles going on with those houses. Just from a color theory standpoint, warm colors tend to come forward in a piece. Cool colors tend to go backward. So I definitely wanted the houses, number one, because a lot of them have brickwork on them or warmer elements on them. I wanted them to come forward, so I added a lot of warm tones to those. But I wanted those skylines to go backward a little bit, so I kept them cooler for the most part. And I thought it was really cool to kind of have this like double layer of skylines in the background to add some atmospheric perspective. That ended up coming out pretty nicely. And then for that stuff on the outside, I wanted to, because there's so much of it, because I've been in design for 10 years, I wanted to reduce cognitive overload, which is when your brain can't figure out what to focus on. Because there's so much stuff there. I wanted to reduce that cognitive overload by making that as dark as possible, but still giving you enough detail to see kind of the spirit of what was going on. And that's it. So thanks for watching. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me for 20 minutes. And come follow me on Crooked and Beautiful on Instagram or take a look at my shop. All right, thanks guys.